Something unprecedented is happening right now in American cities. And if you're not paying attention, you're missing one of the most important power struggles of our time. We're watching the federal government weaponize law enforcement against local democracy in ways we haven't seen in generations. Police chiefs across the country are being forced into an impossible position: comply with Trump's executive orders that militarize their departments and turn local cops into immigration enforcers, or face federal prosecution. This isn't theoretical anymore. In Washington, D.C., the Trump administration literally federalized the entire Metropolitan Police Department, stripping the mayor and police chief of their authority. Attorney General Pam Bondi invoked an obscure provision of the 1973 Home Rule Act to seize control, requiring that every police directive receive federal approval before implementation. Meanwhile, Trump's April executive order offers police departments military weapons, expanded legal immunity, and threatens to prosecute any local official who dares implement accountability measures or refuse to participate in immigration raids. What we're witnessing is the construction of a police state infrastructure in real time. Police chiefs in Minneapolis, Chicago, and other cities are issuing warnings, some subtle, some direct, about the erosion of local governance and the transformation of community policing into federal enforcement arms. The choice they face is stark: become agents of mass deportation and militarized control, or risk their departments being targeted by federal prosecutors. This is about more than policing. It's about whether local communities can govern themselves, whether democracy functions at the municipal level, or whether we're shifting toward centralized authoritarian control where dissent is criminalized and local officials who resist federal overreach face prosecution. The implications for civil liberties, immigrant communities, and American democracy itself couldn't be higher. Let's be absolutely clear about what happened in Washington, D.C. in August of last year. This wasn't a response to some genuine emergency. Crime in the nation's capital had reached a 30-year low in 2024. Violent crime was down 26% compared to the previous year. Homicides had dropped 32%. Carjackings, which had spiked in 2023, fell by nearly half in 2024 and continued plummeting through 2025. Every single metric showed DC was getting safer, not more dangerous. But Donald Trump stood in front of cameras and declared that the capital city had been overtaken by violent gangs, bloodthirsty criminals, roving mobs of violent youth, drugged-out maniacs, and homeless people. He invoked Section 740 of the D.C. Home Rule Act for the first time in history, claiming special conditions of an emergency nature existed. The law is crystal clear about when this power can be used. It requires actual emergency conditions, not political theater, not manufactured crises, but genuine emergencies. Crime at a 30-year low doesn't qualify as an emergency by any rational standard. What Trump actually did was deploy 800 National Guard troops into the streets of Washington, surge 500 federal agents from agencies like the FBI, DEA, ATF, ICE, and the U.S. Marshals Service into the city, and strip Mayor Muriel Bowser and Police Chief Pamela Smith of their authority over the Metropolitan Police Department. Attorney General Pam Bondi assumed control, requiring every police directive to receive federal approval before implementation. Think about that for a moment. The elected mayor of a city of over 700,000 people, a city that pays federal taxes but has no voting representation in Congress, was told that her police department now answers to the president's attorney general. Every decision about how to police D.C. neighborhoods, how to allocate resources, what enforcement priorities to pursue, all of it now required sign-off from federal officials who don't live in those communities and aren't accountable to D.C. residents. The pretext was laughably transparent. Trump cited an incident where a 19-year-old former DOJ employee was allegedly assaulted by two 15-year-old boys. That became the justification for federalizing an entire police department and deploying military forces into American streets. D.C. Congresswoman Eleanor Holmes Norton called it what it was: an historic assault on D.C. home rule and a counterproductive seizure of the city's resources. The ACLU of D.C. pointed out that the administration used false pretenses and that D.C. was being treated as a testing ground for tactics Trump planned to use nationwide, and they were right. Trump explicitly said he was looking at doing the same thing in Chicago, New York, Los Angeles, Baltimore, Philadelphia, Portland, Seattle, and San Francisco. Every single one of those cities has a Democratic mayor. Every single one of them is majority minority. This isn't about crime. It's about power and political retaliation. Here's where it gets even more disturbing. In April of 2025, Trump signed an executive order titled Strengthening and Unleashing America's Law Enforcement to Pursue Criminals and Protect Innocent Citizens. The language alone should set off alarm bells. When a government talks about unleashing police, when it frames law enforcement as something that needs to be freed from restraints, you're looking at the architecture of a police state. This executive order did several things simultaneously. First, it authorized the provision of military weapons and equipment to local police departments with minimal oversight. We're talking about the 1033 program, which for decades has funneled excess military hardware to civilian law enforcement. Armored vehicles, grenade launchers, bayonets, weaponized aircraft. Previous administrations tried to impose restrictions and oversight standards. Trump's order reversed those protections and opened the floodgates for militarization without accountability. Second, the order expanded legal immunity for police officers who use aggressive tactics. It directed the Attorney General to provide free private sector legal representation to officers who face expenses and liabilities for actions taken during their official duties. Now, most police officers who belong to unions already receive legal services when they're accused of wrongdoing, but this creates a parallel system where the federal government steps in to defend officers, potentially even those whose own departments or cities have determined cross the line. The order doesn't define what constitutes an unjust expense or liability. Who decides? The Attorney General appointed by Trump. This is a recipe for shielding brutal cops from accountability while using federal resources to do it. Third, and this is crucial, the executive order threatens to prosecute state and local officials who try to implement police accountability measures or who refuse to cooperate with federal enforcement priorities. Section 5 specifically directs the Attorney General to pursue all necessary legal remedies and prioritize prosecution of officials in jurisdictions whose officials willfully and unlawfully direct the obstruction of criminal law or unlawfully engage in discrimination or civil rights violations under the guise of diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives. Let's decode that language. What they're calling obstruction of criminal law includes things like cities implementing consent decrees to reform police departments with patterns of constitutional violations, mayors who establish civilian review boards to investigate police misconduct, or officials who direct their police departments not to participate in immigration enforcement operations. What they're calling discrimination under the guise of DEI includes efforts to diversify police departments, training programs that address implicit bias and racial profiling, or policies designed to build trust between law enforcement and communities of color. The executive order explicitly directs the Attorney General to review all ongoing federal consent decrees and out-of-court agreements with law enforcement agencies and to modify, rescind, or move to conclude such measures that unduly impede the performance of law enforcement functions. Consent decrees are court-supervised agreements that cities enter into after the Department of Justice finds patterns of unconstitutional policing. These agreements require reforms like use of force policies, de-escalation training, early warning systems for officers with patterns of complaints, and accountability mechanisms. Cities like Minneapolis, Chicago, Baltimore, Cleveland, and Ferguson entered these agreements after federal investigations documented systemic violations of civil rights. Trump's order seeks to terminate those protections, calling them impediments to law enforcement. Fourth, the order directs the use of military and national security assets to support local law enforcement. Section 4 tells the Attorney General, Secretary of Defense, and Secretary of Homeland Security to assess how to utilize training, non-lethal capabilities, and other military resources to aggressively police communities. This isn't hypothetical. In D.C., we saw National Guard troops patrolling streets. In Los Angeles, during immigration raids, DHS deployed Predator drones for surveillance and fired less lethal weapons at journalists and activists. In Portland, Border Patrol tactical units threw protesters into unmarked vans. The order formalizes and expands these tactics, blurring the line between military operations and domestic policing in ways that violate the fundamental principles of the Posse Comitatus Act. Now let's talk about what this means on the ground in cities across America. In Minneapolis, Police Chief Brian O'Hara issued a warning to his officers in December of 2025. He told them that if they witnessed ICE agents using unlawful force and didn't intervene, they would be fired. This is significant. Minneapolis is where George Floyd was murdered by police officer Derek Chauvin. The city implemented a duty to intervene policy precisely because officers stood by and watched while Chauvin knelt on Floyd's neck for 9 minutes and 29 seconds. O'Hara extended that duty to cover unlawful force by any law enforcement officer, including federal agents. He said, "This is where George Floyd died because of the actions of Minneapolis police. Our officers here have a duty to intervene, not just from law enforcement, from our own agency." This put O'Hara in direct confrontation with the Trump administration. The administration had sent over 2,000 federal agents to Minneapolis in what they called the biggest immigration enforcement operation in history. These agents conducted aggressive raids throughout the city, targeting the Somali community in particular. Trump had called Minnesota's Somali population garbage and threatened to end temporary protected status for Somalis, baselessly claiming that federal money was flowing to the militant group Al-Shabaab. On January 7, 2026, an ICE agent shot and killed Renee Nicole Good, a 37-year-old mother of 3. Video footage showed the agent firing at point-blank range as Good sat in her car. The Trump administration immediately claimed she had violently run over an ICE officer and that the shooting was self-defense. But the video clearly contradicted that narrative. The car never touched the officer. Vice President J.D. Vance called Good's death a tragedy of her own making and blamed leftist ideology. Homeland Security Secretary Kristi Noem labeled it an act of domestic terrorism, referring to Good, not the federal agent who killed her. President Trump praised the officer's actions. The FBI took over the investigation and cut the Minnesota Bureau of Criminal Apprehension out of the process, despite that agency being specifically created after George Floyd's murder to review use-of-force cases independently. State officials said that without complete access to evidence, witnesses, and information, they couldn't meet the investigative standards that Minnesota law and the public demands. The federal government seized control of the investigation to protect its own. In response to the killing, the Trump administration didn't pull back or promise accountability. They surged hundreds more federal officers into Minneapolis. Homeland Security Secretary Noem announced on Fox News that they were sending additional forces to allow ICE and Border Patrol individuals to work safely. Safely from what? From protesters exercising their First Amendment rights? From local officials demanding transparency? The show of force intensified. Meanwhile, O'Hara had warned weeks before the shooting that the way ICE was conducting operations made tragedy almost inevitable. He said there's a very heightened risk when enforcement activity is being conducted on the street, when situations are very tense and things are very emotionally charged. He was calling for transparency and coordination with local law enforcement. The Trump administration ignored him, and then Renee Good was killed. Chicago faced similar dynamics. The city has a welcoming city ordinance that prohibits city employees from assisting federal immigration agents in nearly all circumstances. But during what the administration called Operation Midway Blitz, federal agents flooded Chicago neighborhoods conducting immigration raids. Community members reported that Chicago Police Department officers showed up at raid locations, raising questions about whether CPD was violating the ordinance. Police Superintendent Larry Snelling insisted his officers complied with the law and that CPD must respond to all calls and maintain peace while ensuring people can exercise their right to protest. But residents weren't buying it. Over 2,000 Chicagoans signed a petition demanding that the Community Commission for Public Safety and Accountability hold a public hearing to investigate CPD's conduct. At that hearing in January 2026, speaker after speaker accused CPD of enabling federal agents who were terrorizing immigrant communities. Eliane Bahina, chief of staff for an alderman and member of a police district council, said community members are treated like they're the threat when all we have are our whistles and our bodies while masked men stand there with their guns. When ICE and Border Patrol terrorized our neighborhoods and the Chicago Police Department shows up, we're left asking one simple question: who are they protecting? Bahena herself had been detained by federal agents in October without charges after a raid in Little Village sparked protests. Multiple speakers called for CPD to arrest Border Patrol Chief Greg Bovino, though state and local law enforcement generally lack authority to investigate federal agents acting in their official capacity. That's the structural problem. Federal agents operate with impunity in cities where local officials and residents have no mechanism to hold them accountable. The pattern is clear. The Trump administration identifies cities with Democratic leadership, cities with large immigrant populations, cities that have implemented police reforms or progressive criminal justice policies. Then it manufactures a crisis narrative. Crime is out of control. Cities are overrun by violent gangs. Local officials are obstructing law enforcement. The actual crime statistics show the opposite. Crime has been declining in most major cities. New York, Los Angeles, Chicago, Philadelphia all saw sustained declines in violent crime during 2024 and 2025. Minneapolis saw homicides drop 12% in 2025 after a 32% drop the year before. But facts don't matter when you're building authoritarian infrastructure. The administration then deploys overwhelming federal force: National Guard troops, ICE agents, Border Patrol tactical units, U.S. Marshals, FBI, DEA, ATF. They conduct highly visible operations designed to intimidate communities and dominate public space. In DCO, you had soldiers in Humvees patrolling blocks from the Capitol. In Minneapolis, masked federal agents raided Somali community centers. In Los Angeles, DHS flew surveillance drones over neighborhoods and fired less lethal rounds at journalists. These aren't law enforcement operations designed to solve crimes or improve public safety. They're demonstrations of federal power meant to break local resistance and normalize military occupation of American cities. Then comes the legal warfare. The April executive order creates the framework for prosecuting local officials who resist, mayors who won't cooperate with immigration enforcement, city council members who pass sanctuary policies, police chiefs who try to maintain accountability standards, prosecutors who decline to charge people for low-level offenses. All of them can now be targeted for federal prosecution under vague charges of obstructing law enforcement or engaging in civil rights violations through DEI initiatives. This is how you criminalize dissent at the municipal level. You make it a federal crime for elected officials to implement the policies their constituents voted for. And here's the truly insidious part. Most Americans don't follow the details of federal-local jurisdictional conflicts. They don't know about Section 740 of the D.C. Home Rule Act or the legal standards for invoking emergency powers. They don't understand consent decrees or the 1033 program or the Posse Comitatus Act. What they see is their government telling them that cities are dangerous, that crime is surging, that tough action is needed. The visual imagery of National Guard troops and federal agents in tactical gear reinforces that narrative even when it's completely divorced from reality. It creates a feedback loop where the federal presence itself becomes evidence of the emergency that supposedly justified the federal presence in the first place. This is why police chiefs like Brian O'Hara in Minneapolis matter so much right now. These are officials who understand both the professional standards of law enforcement and the political dynamics at play. O'Hara isn't some defund the police activist. He's a career police chief responsible for public safety in a major American city. When he says that federal operations are being conducted in ways that heighten risk and make tragedy inevitable, that's a professional assessment. When he tells his officers they must intervene if they witness federal agents using unlawful force, he's upholding the duty to intervene principle that came out of the George Floyd murder. When he increases police presence at Somali community centers to protect residents from federal raids, he's making a choice about who his department serves. Those choices put him in direct conflict with an administration that views local officials as obstacles to be overcome or punished. The Department of Homeland Security responded to O'Hara's intervention directive by asking whether he wanted his officers to intervene when ICE arrests convicted murderers, rapists, and gang members. That framing is deliberate. It conflates all immigration enforcement with targeting the worst criminals, even though the vast majority of people caught in these raids have no violent criminal history. It suggests that any limitation on federal agents' actions is protecting dangerous criminals, and it implies that local police chiefs who try to maintain constitutional standards are endangering public safety. We're watching the federal government systematically dismantle local control over policing while building a framework for authoritarian law enforcement. The DC federalization shows they can seize control of police departments in the nation's capital. The April executive order threatens prosecution of officials who implement accountability measures. The mass deployment of federal agents into cities creates an occupying force that operates outside local oversight. The provision of military equipment and expanded immunity encourages aggressive tactics. The termination of consent decrees removes the reforms that previous administrations fought for after documenting systemic civil rights violations. Every piece fits together, and it's not stopping with the cities already targeted. Trump has explicitly named Chicago, Baltimore, New York, Portland, Seattle, San Francisco, Oakland, Los Angeles as future targets. The criteria aren't crime rates. They're political affiliation and willingness to resist federal overreach. The message to other cities is clear. Comply with federal demands regardless of what your voters want, or face federalization, prosecution, and military occupation. This is how democracy dies at the local level, not with a single dramatic coup, but with the gradual criminalization of local governance that doesn't align with federal political priorities. Police chiefs in these cities are being forced to make impossible choices. Do they follow local laws and policies, including sanctuary ordinances and accountability measures that their city councils passed and their voters support? Or do they comply with federal demands backed by threats of prosecution and the withdrawal of federal funding? Do they protect their communities from what many residents experience as federal aggression? Or do they cooperate with federal agents whose tactics they believe violate professional standards and constitutional rights? These aren't theoretical dilemmas. These are the daily decisions facing law enforcement leaders in cities across America right now. The warnings from chiefs like O'Hara aren't just about immigration enforcement or police tactics. They're about the fundamental structure of American governance. Can cities govern themselves? Can local officials implement policies their communities support without facing federal prosecution? Can police departments maintain professional standards when the federal government is actively encouraging aggressive policing and providing legal cover for officers who use excessive force? Can communities hold law enforcement accountable when federal agents operate with impunity and local officials who try to impose oversight face criminal charges? These questions have profound implications for civil liberties, for immigrant communities who are being terrorized regardless of their legal status, for Black and brown communities who have borne the brunt of aggressive policing for generations, and for American democracy itself. When the president can declare an emergency in a city experiencing historic lows in crime and use that manufactured crisis to seize control of local police, we've crossed a line. When federal agents can kill a woman in her car, lie about what happened, seize control of the investigation, and face no consequences while the administration praises their actions, we've crossed another line.